Thanks, John. Good morning to everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and to share with you the project, Bird Friendly Maple Project, which is kind of a near and dear thing to me for a number of reasons. But as John mentioned, I'm a conservation biologist with Audubon, Vermont. If you don't know what Audubon is, it's not the highway in Germany where you can drive really fast. That's the Autobahn. Although we do get mail at our office that has Audubon on it. So Audubon is it's a national group. We are part of the National Audubon Society, so we are a bird conservation group really focused on birds and other wildlife and really the habitats that they need in order to survive. So I like to involve the audience in various ways throughout the presentation. So just because you're in the front doesn't mean you'll get picked on. Usually I pick people in the back because they sat in the back hoping they wouldn't get picked on. But don't worry. First question I have for all of you, how many of you like maple syrup? We're in Vermont, yeah. Are there any maple producers here? Great. Next question, how many of you like to watch birds? Okay. How many of you consider yourselves birders? This is where everybody does this all the time. When I ask if you're a birder, I'm not sure. I don't know what a birder means sometimes. So if you like birds, if you like to watch birds, I consider you to be a birder. You don't have to have a life list or keep track of everything you see or put your things onto eBird, which is an online data collection point in order to like birds. So if you like maple syrup, you like birds, you make maple syrup, you consider yourself a birder, you're in the right place today. Because the Bird Friendly Maple Project that we're going to hear a little bit more about really is to bring together these two aspects of Vermont. The role that our state plays in bird conservation and of course the very important role that our state plays in maple syrup production. So let's take a look at this. So here are some scenes, obviously, that are pretty common right now. We are already, maple sugaring seems to happen earlier and earlier every year when the sap is running, but the bottom, kind of the U images around the bottom are all scenes from the Green Mountain Audubon Center in Huntington, which is where our main office is. We do about 500 taps the old-fashioned way. We still use buckets. We do collect with a tractor, not horses. And we still use wood-fired evaporator to boil that sap down into syrup. Of course, the old buckets are kind of going by the wayside, and most people today who are making syrup are using the tubing like you see up there in the upper photo. That's my own personal sugar bush that I have in Moortown, and it certainly makes the process of collecting that sap a lot easier than the buckets do. I don't think it comes as a surprise to anybody here to know that Vermont leads the way in making maple syrup in the United States. Now, of course, if we go across the border into Canada and Quebec in particular, they lead the world. But in terms of the U.S., this is statistics from 2016, but they're still pretty consistent with what we had last year. So Vermont made in 2016 just shy of 2 million gallons of maple syrup, which accounted for almost 50% of the entire crop coming out of the United States. So it's, and then you look at who's next is New York. But they're way, way down there in terms of the percentage that they're contributing, and everybody else kind of follows off in line as well. So the purpose of this image is to say something you already know, which is we're big when it comes to producing maple syrup. And that's all we're going to do in talking about making maple syrup today. Because now we're going to shift focus from those forests that we use that we collect and harvest our sap from to process to maple syrup, which we know are called sugar bushes. We're going to focus to what those sugar bushes are like the rest of the year. A lot of times when we think about maple, we think about March and April, and we think about those forests and the sap that comes from them. And then as soon as sugaring is over and the equipment's cleaned up, many of us forget about those forests. And what they're still doing. They're there 365 days a year. They don't go away at the end of maple sugaring season. Those forests are still there. The sap collection and the pipeline system is still there. But those forests take on a much different role, much more significant role for other things during the non-sugaring time of the year. And that's in terms of bird habitat. So this map, just to kind of interpret it for, I love maps. I think maps do a great job of storytelling, and this map tells a particular story. The colors represent results of a program called the North American Breeding Bird Survey, which is one of the longest running bird survey programs that we have in this country. It goes back 40 plus years of collecting bird data. And the colors represent the average number of bird species that have been encountered on these survey routes over that time period. And you can see that Vermont and the rest of northern New England and the Adirondack Park, and then also the upper Midwest, have the red color, which denotes the highest, I'm not going to say diversity, I'm going to call it species richness. So the highest number of species of birds during the breeding months, the summer months when birds are here nesting, than anywhere else in the U.S. Sometimes we're referred to as a breeding bird factory, the nursery for these birds, because we have, if you want to, people like to travel, those birders that like to travel to different places to see different birds. Gentleman here was telling about his daughter working in Texas and the variety of different birds they have down there. But when people want to maximize how many birds they might be able to see, I just tell them to stay home and go out into their forest. These colors represent forest-specific birds, by the way, not all birds, and that has a little bit to do with it. But why so many forest birds in Vermont and northern New England? We have a lot of forests, that's right. More than 75% of our state is covered in forest, and consequently, we have a lot of birds that are going to be using that for nesting habitat. Anybody been out in the woods this winter? Hear a lot of birds singing? Yeah? Well, good for you if you did. Because it's pretty quiet, I mean relative. There's some birds. We have year-round resident birds, chickadees, different woodpeckers, nuthatches, etc. But a lot of that number of species comes from birds that are only here during the summer months in those forests. And these are birds that we often refer to as neotropical migrant bird species. If you've heard that term before, essentially what it means, if we're talking about a neotropical migrant bird species, it's a bird species whose winter population, a significant proportion of its winter population, goes south of the Tropic of Cancer, which is the red line that's on the map there. That population then returns above the Tropic of Cancer to nest in the spring and summer months. So birds that kind of go back and forth between those north of the Tropic of Cancer, south of it, are referred to as neotropical migrant bird species. And a lot of our birds that make up that number of species in our forests fit into this category of neotropical migrants. As an example, this stunning bird here, which we sometimes refer to with, everybody knows the red-winged blackbird, right? Conklary, it'll be back in our wetlands here pretty soon. This is the black-winged redbird, kind of the converse of that. But also more appropriately known as the Scarlet Tanager. This is the male Scarlet Tanager. If you were to see it right now, looking for this, you'd be searching for a very long time. Because in the winter months, the plumage, the coloration of those feathers, changes completely to kind of a drab, greenish, yellowish color, still the blackish coloration there to the wing. So very different colors from where it is now in South America. That's where that bird is right now. But it will return back up. We're kind of in Vermont. We're at the northern edge of this bird's breeding range, but nonetheless, it's a bird that we still have fairly common in our forest. And this has become the poster bird, if you will, for our bird-friendly maple project, which I'll get into here in just a little bit. What that project is trying to do, a bird-friendly maple project, is to take this extremely important aspect of our state's forests, the maple syrup production end of things, and combine it with this very important aspect of our state's forests, our region's forests, and that being the summer nesting habitat for this high abundance and variety of different bird species. Does anybody happen to know any of these birds? You should know one of them. The one in the upper left was the black-winged redbird, also known as Scarlet Tanager. Anybody know the one in the bottom left? Black-throated blue warbler. Black-throated blue warbler. Well, that bird's in the Caribbean right now, most likely. How about the one on the right? Thrush. It is a thrush, and we have a variety of thrushes that live in the lower elevation forests of our state. The state bird being hermit, that is not the hermit thrush. That is a wood thrush. wood thrush. And that bird is probably in Mexico right now. Matter of fact, that bird, and even the Scarlet Tanager, actually all three of them may even be in coffee plantations right now, which brings an interesting twist to some of this. Coffee plantations producing something I love, coffee. That's where they winter. And then they come back up here to our sugar bushes, where we produce maple syrup, which I also love. And you put the two together, and you have a really good tasting coffee. Okay? So these birds connect us and people in places that are working the landscape. The economic importance of these products is unparalleled, certainly. And so birds are a way to kind of connect us to these things. It's something that I haven't gotten into yet, but I hope to explore that someday with bird-friendly coffee, which some people may be familiar with, which is a thing. You can go out and purchase bird-friendly coffee, meaning that the coffee plantations were or are managed in ways that support more than just coffee shrubs. It's not a monoculture of shrubs. It's actually a natural forest, with coffee plants being one of the many things that are there. So the project we started about 4 years ago, really pretty young yet in its implementation. And it's a partnership among Audubon, Vermont, Vermont Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation, and the Vermont Maple Sugar Makers Association, which is the trade organization for maple here in the state. And this is one of the things that Audubon works really hard on with all its programs, is to form these partnerships with other stakeholders, whatever it is we're talking about. Matter of fact, from the Forest, Parks and Recreation standpoint, my biggest colleague that I work with on all sorts of forest issues is your county forester, Nancy Patch, right here, her office in town. And she's been an excellent steward in helping to promote this as well, and to work with us on forest issues. So the Bird Friendly Maple Project really is this partnership designed, as I've said before, to bring together, integrate our sugar bushes, which are managed for sap production, but also bring consideration for managing them for bird habitat characteristics as well. And there are some market benefits to maple producers who work with us, and we'll get into that here in a little bit. But let's look at what are some things that might make a sugar bush bird friendly or not as bird friendly. But most importantly, I do need to tell you, if you don't remember anything from what I talked about today, please remember this one thing. Just because a maple producer is not participating in this project does not mean that they're doing something bad for birds. So sugar bushes are inherently good for birds. Anybody think why that might be? No matter how they're managed, inherently, by having a sugar bush that you're tapping and collecting sap from is good for birds. Any thoughts why? It's habitat, right? It's still forest. And if it's not forest anymore, and it gets converted to some other use, then it's not habitat at all for those birds. So just by the fact that it stays as a forest is super critical. Habitat loss is one of the greatest threats to any of these birds, and there are others we'll get to as well. But forest as forest is really important, and sugar bushes do that. Now, how they're managed, how those forests that we tap are managed, can just make it okay habitat, or can actually make it very high quality, which means that the birds have a high likelihood that they will successfully nest and raise the next generation of their species, which is kind of the ultimate thing that we're looking for. A lot of the birds that we're talking about have been showing long-term population declines throughout their breeding range. They're not rare, threatened, or endangered at this point in time, and we'd like to keep it that way. So we're trying to be proactive now to make sure that we provide the habitat that these birds need to nest successfully, so that we don't reach the point where we're now, the species is rare, what are we going to do about it? We usually end up throwing a lot more resources into it. We may have success, we may not. So we can be proactive now and start to work to incorporate those things into our management. So here's a sugar bush in outside of Montpelier, Vermont, and there's something about this forest that is pretty common in a lot of sugar bushes, but not necessarily what we would like to see when it comes to thinking about having a variety of bird species in the forest. Anybody think they can identify how many different tree species are in this photo? It's pretty much a monoculture of sugar maples. So I think pretty much all of those trees that you see there are sugar maple trees. Well, if you're making maple syrup and you want to manage your forest for doing that, you want to have sugar maple trees, or red maple as well. But if we do that to the exclusion of everything else, now we're starting to do some things that are lowering the value of that forest for birds, as well as actually the long term of sugaring. We'll come to that too later on. Sometimes sugar bushes are dominated by sugar maple monocultures due to years, generations of management to favor maple. That's kind of the way it has been. Other times it has to do with the soil types that are there. And some sites just grow sugar maple really well, even though people didn't manage it for that. That's what it's there, and all other tree species are pretty much devoid in that area. But nonetheless, however it got there, these maple monocultures, sugar maple monocultures, are not really what we're looking for. Something like these two photos are a little more, in terms of composition of the species, the composition of trees in the sugar bush, are a little bit more of some things we'd like to see. Here on the left, we've got an American beech tree, which is very common in the forest types that we tend to manage for sugar bushes, northern hardwood forests. We also have some nice hobble bush growing in the lower layers there, that big leafed plant. On the right-hand side, we have some maple, but there's also some softwood in there, some hemlock, or maybe red spruce, also as part of that forest mix. And when we have forests that have a more diverse composition of tree species in them, we're going to have a much more diverse composition of bird species in them. Monocultures of anything tend to reduce any biodiversity in an area compared to something that's a little more diverse. So what we're asking producers to do that have been engaging with us and working with us is to have at least 25% of their tapped sugar bush in species other than sugar maple. As a matter of fact, now, if your sugar bush is in Vermont's use value appraisal program or current use, that's also a requirement with current use. As you have to, and if you don't have it, let's say you have 90% sugar maple, well, it's going to take a while to get to be, 75%. So it just means you have to have a plan, a management plan that's kind of driving you in that direction. So instead of continuing to cut anything that's not a maple out, you need to try to increase that variety of tree species through your management. And that makes a significant difference on the bird community as well. A lot of the data that I'm presenting here today comes out of my own research that I did as a master's student at Antioch when I looked at this topic, as well as, because there really wasn't anything out there in the literature on sugar bushes in particular and influence on bird communities. We have a lot of data and a lot of research on northern hardwood forests and how they're managed in bird communities. So we're kind of bringing the two disciplines together to come up with these recommendations. And these recommendations that we're talking about, I should mention, is something that I worked very closely with Nancy Patch to come up with. All right, so here's another aspect that we're going to focus on of sugar bushes. And instead of just telling you from the get-go here what we're looking at, I want you to look at this picture. The last pictures, we looked at the composition of the forest, meaning what are the tree species. So we're going to skip that part now. Now we're going to look at something called structure. Composition and structure. So look at without telling you what that structure is, just look at this photo first. And then look at these two photos in comparison to that last one. I'll go back to this one. And we go to this. If we're thinking about structure, think about what that term might mean. What do you see as kind of a stark difference between both of these photos and this one? There you go. That undergrowth, that low layer of vegetation that is coming back into the forest. Actually, if we go back even further to that, there's lots of undergrowth in that forest. It just happens to be ferns, hay-scented ferns, to be a matter of fact, which really inhibit trees from being able to get going and grow there. So that's not the kind of structure we want to see. There's nothing diverse about that understory at all. But that does have some different things happening. So from a maple producer's standpoint, you may not be as excited by what's the understory growth on the left picture, which again is that hobble bush. People familiar with hobble bush? It's this big leaved, and around this part of the state, you kind of have to go up a little higher in the elevations before you start to find it. It's a very large leaved native shrub. It only grows maybe 5 or 6 feet tall at the most. It grows very thickly, and it's called a hobble bush because as you try to walk through it, the way it grows, it hobbles you and really slows your movement. So imagine the people running that main line and those lateral lines through that hobble bush. They did it, though, without clearing out that understory, and that was a really good thing. So Black-throated blue warbler that we've seen a picture of love hobble bush to nest in. They nest only within the first 5 to 6 feet of the ground, and the structure that hobble bush provides is perfect for them. But most maple producers would probably rather see the photo on the right, which happens to be sugar maple seedlings and small saplings which are growing in the understory as well. But irregardless of what the species is, it's that structure, understory, low understory structure, that the majority of our birds nest in. So there aren't a lot of birds that nest high in the forest. And all we have is, go back to that one again, there's really nowhere else to nest if you're a bird, unless you nest on the ground or high up. There's no other structure in that forest. So for producers that are involved with us in the program, what we ask them to do, we want to make sure that their forest management plan, which kind of guides what they do in the woods, is going to be helping to establish or increase regeneration of young growth in the forest. Not just tending to the trees that you're tapping now by thinning them out, but also getting some regeneration to happen in that low understory so that those birds will have a place where they can nest and also go around looking for insects, which is their main food source. Here's 2 other aspects that we ask people to work towards. The photo on the left, this is, again, my woods that I tap. And there's something there that a lot of maple producers would probably not want to necessarily see with their pipeline system. What is it? It's that big standing dead tree, right, which we call snags. And this tree is also, we call this actually currently is a live tree, believe it or not, but it has those cavities, those holes that are in it. So we have snag trees which are standing dead, and we have cavity trees which could be dead with holes, or they could even be live trees that have holes in them as well. Really critical aspect, you can tell this tree in particular, maple tree, you know who made those holes? Yeah, the pileated woodpecker, that really large, I call the woody woodpecker one. It's the biggest woodpecker we have. Those cavities are for feeding. So those big oblong or oval-shaped cavities that you see on trees are made by pileated woodpeckers. They're looking for insects in the tree. So even though that tree is alive, it's not going to be for long. There's a lot of decay happening in it. The woodpeckers know that, and they've been trying to search them out. But there's a reason that maple producers don't really like the fact that snag, or that cavity tree, excuse me, it's not a snag yet, is right in the middle of their pipeline. Because once that tree becomes a snag, eventually it's going to come over and it's going to take out my lines and require me to go back in and repair them. So in the general forest management scenario of things, the recommendation we often give for any wildlife is to have 6 or more snags or cavity trees per acre. The bigger the better. 10 inches in diameter at 4.5 feet off the ground. We measure trees at that height. It's called DBH, diameter at breast height. So 10-inch diameter tree is ideal. Bigger is better because more wildlife can use it. We realized that to ask a maple producer to have 6 or more of these trees per acre would not go well and may kind of keep some people out and not want to get involved. So we reduced that number to say we know that's high and it may not work in our pipeline system. How about 2 per acre? And that seemed to have gone a little bit better with folks. We know that we have something, we're not taking them all down, but we still have something out there in the forest. And that's the important part. So when those snags come down, then they create what you see on the right-hand side there, which is just outside you can't see the pipeline system, but it's very close by. I don't know if you can see what this is. That is a very large log of tree that came down on the ground. And that's something we call coarse woody material, coarse being thick. Coarse woody material, for many people who think about that in wildlife terms, it's kind of the classic place where a partridge or ruffed grouse would get up onto and do their thoop, 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 drumming in the spring as their courtship. But underneath that log, it's teeming with, in the summer months, with insects and redback salamanders and all kinds of macroinvertebrates living there, all of which are bird food. So as those things come out, the birds can feed on them. So they're a drumming site for ruffed grouse. They can be a place that sources out food for the birds that are in the forest as well. And they can also help protect some of the young growth in the forest. You know, we have a pretty high density of deer in many parts of our state, white-tailed deer. In some places they can do quite a number on, when we do get some of that young growth happening, the deer like to come in and eat it all off. But when you have this dead material on the ground, it can actually help to protect those seedlings so they can actually grow up through it. Well, not through that, but through branches and smaller stuff, so that they're able to get above the height that the deer will come in and browse on them, and that's a good thing. So we've got our tree species composition. We want to have at least 25% of our sugar bush be non-sugar maple. We have structure. We want to see that understory coming up into the forest. And we do what we ask people to do there. I do an ocular estimation, eyeball it, when I go out and I do an inventory in these woods. And we want to see, on average, about 25% cover across the sugar bush forest floor in those shrubs. And if they don't have it, we ask them to do things in their plans to try to get it in time. Snags, we want to see 2 per acre. And coarse woody material, we want to see at least 4 logs greater than 10 inches in diameter and greater than 3 feet long on the forest floor. That's not a lot, to be honest with you. Most of the sugar bushes that I'm in, I'm tallying 30 pieces per acre. So by only asking for 4, we could actually bump that up and people would still be in pretty good shape. So the way that we go about all of this, and we get maple producers to kind of engage with us and be involved in the program, and when I say be involved with the program, what I'm getting to is something that's coming up later, which is a recognition aspect for those people that do that. But what we do is we go out, a maple producer says, yeah, I'm interested in this, hearing what you might have to say. So I go out and I do a complete sugar bush forest inventory and assessment of habitat conditions. So a forest inventory is something that they would probably do anyway if they have a forester, to kind of get some basic information about those trees and quantitative data. So we do that, but we also do something that looks more at the habitat variables and quantify those as well. So we're not just thinking about sap production now or timber production. We're thinking about the birds that are in that forest nesting and the habitat elements that they're looking for, and quantify those. So we do that full inventory and assessment. We analyze the data and we put that into a written report. Here you can see this is the Brandon family maple orchards, very large maple producers that are working with us. And they get that report. They can go through it and see firsthand where the gaps are between the condition of their sugar bush today and what we'd like it to be, the standards that we've set forth. And if they agree to address those gaps through their forest management plan and agree to manage for those things in the future, then they are able to be what we call recognized in the program. It's not, and people use the term, and I don't worry too much about it, but it's not a true certification program at this point. We don't have a third party that comes in and kind of verifies anything, which I think is important for certification. So we call it a recognition program. And when maple producer signs off on that document that you saw on the last slide, saying, yep, we're on board, we agree to address these things to make our sugar bush more bird friendly, then they can start to promote their maple products, saying that they're managing those woods with birds in mind. So a couple things they get a sign that they can put up. So we've got the sign right here. What's the bird? Black-winged redbird, Scarlet Tanager. So they can put those up on their sugar house or in their retail place if they have that. They also are able to use stickers, and this is hard to see, but it's basically that same sign in the form of a sticker. So you'll see organic producers have an organic sticker. You have the grading sticker that goes on the cap usually, but this is a sticker that if you see that means that syrup came from a sugar bush that is being managed with birds in mind. Our recognition aspect of all this stops in the forest. So we're not saying that this product meet some special bird thing. It just says that the product that's in here came from a forest that is being managed to a certain standard now when it comes to bird habitat. So you might, if you haven't seen this sticker on a container yet, or other maple products, or if you do see it now, you'll know what that means. To date, again, I said we're in year 4. Year number 1 was really just kind of getting it all put together. So I've had 3 years of meeting with producers, getting them involved. To date, we have 27 producers who are currently recognized from throughout the state that are working with us. And when you manage your forest with birds in mind, this is some of the producers put these on their websites now. Their retail, if they do retail on a website, to kind of denote their participation. If you manage with your sugar bush with birds in mind, though, there's all these other benefits that come along with it. And this is one of the ways that I think, have been able to engage with some producers who may have said, birds are cool and all, but I'm making syrup. That's what we need to do first and foremost. But making syrup in the future really requires that your forest stays healthy and able to respond to all the challenges that our forests face today in the long term. So if you manage your forest with birds in mind, you address a lot of other issues as well. So the first one being any sort of funguses that attack maples or diseases that attack maple. We have some common things that can affect our forests. On the right-hand side there, we have Utapella, which is a fungus that can cause individual trees to decline. And on the right is a sugar maple borer insect, which can also damage sugar maple trees. The University of Vermont, a few years back, also did a study on looking at the tree species composition of these sugar bushes and how intense disease and insect outbreaks were in them. And I do not think it's coincidental that they basically found this threshold where if you managed, as soon as your sugar bush was more than 70% sugar maple, the intensity and duration of disease outbreaks or insect pests went up correspondingly with it. If you kept your sugar maple composition below that 70% threshold, the duration and intensity of these things was diminished. It's not to say you're not going to have them, but it kind of makes sense intuitively. If you have a monoculture of anything, and you have an insect which affects that thing that you have monoculture of, it's going to it's a smorgasbord for them to take over. A bit of sad news, which doesn't relate directly to sugar maples, but it does relate to our forests, which just came out publicly yesterday. Maybe some people heard about it. The emerald ash borer, which is a non-native insect which affects ash trees, that has been in New Hampshire, Quebec, New York, and Massachusetts, and 30-some other states for a number of years, but had not been found in Vermont, was found in Vermont, in the town of Orange, over in the Upper Valley region, Orange County. So that's the sad thing. These non-native pests, insects, and diseases that come into our forests. So if you manage for diversity of tree species, you can help to mitigate against some of the insects and disease that may be affecting your sugar bush. And I haven't found any maple producer yet who wasn't interested in the health of their sugar bush in the long term. Another thing that we have a lot of problems with in certain parts of the state, we do have it up here certainly, particularly more towards the valley and the lake, non-native plants, non-native and invasive plant species. This is a patch of glossy buckthorn, which is a non-native, honeysuckle, Japanese barberry. Those are kind of the big ones that we often find. These are a significant problem in any forest, and they do produce, many of these things produce a nice fleshy fruit on them, which, as our bird species, which eat mostly insects during the nesting season, but once the young are hatched and out of the nest and kind of on their own, a lot of the birds start to eat fruit in their diet. Those fruits are what build fat on their bodies and allow them to start off on these long migrations. Unfortunately, most of these non-native plants which produce fruits, and birds do eat them, by the way, which adds to another problem because then they disperse the seeds later on somewhere else. They do not have, these birds that we have here are not adapted to having this food source. Their body doesn't process it as well. So they don't get the same level of nutrition out of the non-natives that they do the natives. So kind of, you know, if you're going to hike the Appalachian Trail or even the Long Trail, we'll shorten it down to 200 some miles, not 2,000. If you're going to hike the Long Trail and you just gorge on McDonald's, not picking on McDonald's, fast food, before heading out, you're probably not going to be in the same level of fitness and health as you would be if you were eating something that was more healthy for you. So that's another problem. We have this as one of our requirements, that if you do have non-native and invasive plants in your sugar bush, you need to have a plan for what you're going to do about it. We're not telling you how to deal with it. We're not even saying you have to eradicate it, because I think in many places total eradication is not possible anymore. They're here. We just have to figure out how to minimize their impact on the landscape. Climate change. Climate change is affecting our forests. It's affecting our sugaring right now as well, by having us begin our seasons much earlier than we used to. And it's affecting the forest as well with natural events, windstorms, ice storms, which are becoming, we've always had them, but they are documented becoming more frequently in greater intensity than they have in the past. Managing your forest to be more resilient to natural events that can affect it as a result of climate change, those strategies are very consistent with managing with birds in mind as well. We've been working with the U.S. Forest Service and Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science to kind of look at how managing with birds in mind crosses over and parallels with how we manage to make our forests more resilient in a changing climate, and the parallels are really great. So being involved in the Bird Friendly Maple Project can help producers make their forest as resilient as they can possibly be to the changing climate. And then, of course, this is just the generational aspects of, if we have a healthy forest that is able to respond to climate change and persist, and we can keep tapping those trees, we end up with something very important and special, which is a generational aspect of sugaring. This is folks up in Derby, Jed's Maple Products, Steve Wheeler and his family, who've been sugaring for a number of generations. There's 3 generations here shown, and hopefully they will continue to be able to have that passed down for years to come. So all of these things are kind of added benefits just by thinking about birds in how you're managing your forest. May not seem possible, but it's true, and it's been documented to work for these things as well. So some of the bird species, this is just to show us, this goes back to my research. There were 37 different bird species that I recorded in looking at 10 sugar bushes throughout the state when I did my research on it. The ones that are in yellow highlighted are bird species that are considered to be priority birds for Audubon Vermont's work in general forests, not just sugar bushes, but I do a lot of other non-sugar bush forest bird work as well. And these are the priority species from our list of 40 birds that show up in sugar bushes, from the top being the most abundant to the bottom being the least abundant. So ovenbird, people know ovenbird, it's the one that goes, teacher, 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 in the summertime. Or it also, if you like to eat food, which I think we all do, and you can associate that with oven, it also says pizza, 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 pizza. So you may have heard that bird, you didn't know what it was, but that's the ovenbird. It's a neotropical migrant. It's a warbler, even though it doesn't have warbler in its name, and is the most abundant bird both in sugar bushes and our general northern hardwood forests. But just to kind of show you the role that sugar bushes can play in bird conservation for priority bird species that we have. So let's look at a couple of these, and it won't be long before, let's see, we're almost in March, so 2.5 months, and our forest will start to come alive with the songs of many of these birds. So here's the Scarlet Tanager again. There's the female in the bottom, and then we see this nest with eggs there on the right-hand side. Very flimsy nest. There's not a whole lot to it. And the thing that most benefits Scarlet Tanager in our sugar bush management would be to have that diversity of tree species. They actually prefer we find them most in hardwood forests, but if there's a softwood component, so like hemlock in there, they often will nest in that hemlock, and that's a key thing for them. So let me see if I can get this to play. Almost like a robin. Robins don't do this. Chick-burr. Chick-burr on the end. So, yep, okay, good. Good. Oh. Maybe that's just going to keep playing. No, I think it'll stop. Scarlet Tanagers, we try to describe bird songs, either mnemonics where we assign words to them or just the sound. It is like a robin, a lot like a robin, but it's kind of scratchy. We say it's a robin with a sore throat, is the Scarlet Tanager. If you're in the forest, particularly deeper in the woods, and you hear what sounds like a robin, just keep listening, see if you can detect that scratchiness, and then listen for that chick-burr, because a robin is not going to do that. And that'll likely tell you that you've got a Scarlet Tanager. Remember this one? The Blackthroated blue warbler. So again, the males are always the most colorful of the individuals of a species, because they're trying to draw attention to themselves. They're either trying to attract a mate, or they're defending their territory. They're letting other birds know, hey, this is my spot, stay away. The females, on the other hand, tend to be more drab. They do not want to be noticed, particularly if they're on a nest, on eggs, or even with their young, so they're not drawing attention to themselves. There's the nest of the Black-throated blue warbler down in low. Guess what that plant is? I took that photo, and the plant is a hobblebush. Yes, so in fact they do nest there. It wasn't just me saying it. They do many times. If hobblebush is in the forest, it's very likely Black-throated blue warblers will nest in it. And this song's, let's see if you can come up with a description of it. Oh, I guess that was it. Anybody have a way to describe that to somebody else? Turn to your neighbor and say, I would describe this bird as saying, It's hard, isn't it, with that one? That one doesn't really have a good one. It's just kind of a buzzing. There's a very buzzy quality to it, bzz, 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 sort of quality, and it rises up in pitch. So it goes bzz, 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 bzz. I work a lot with foresters, involve foresters in kind of becoming more aware of the important role of managing with birds in mind. And of course, veneer is a very good wood product, highest value, economic value. So some foresters call it veneer, 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 veneer when they hear the Black-throated blue singing. Others say beer, beer, beer. So you can come up with whatever you'd like to. But that's our Black-throated blue. And again, what's the key thing for sugar bush management to make the habitat best for Black-throated blue? That good low understory cover. Right. This one's, male and female are the same. You wouldn't be able to really tell them apart by this plumage aspect. This is a bird that you probably all have heard and seen even around your homes, even in town here. It likes to nest under the eaves of your deck or maybe right above your door that you come out every day, and up there is the nest right above you. The phoebe that is a flycatcher species, and it says, Phoebe, Phoebe. It sits on a line, it kind of flicks its tail up and down. This is not a phoebe, but this is the wood's cousin, I'll call it, of the phoebe. This is the eastern wood peewee. And we won't find this nesting at our houses. You're going to have to go out into the forest for this one. Of all these migrants, this was one that probably the latest arrival, usually in June before it shows up, some mid-June even, before it shows up in the forest. As a flycatcher, though, it has that characteristic bristly stuff around the base of the bill there. So what these birds do is they'll perch on a branch, and then they'll fly out and grab an insect on the wing, flying insect, and come back and eat it. And so in the sugar bush, having these small little gaps in the canopy that are the result of some of your management efforts allow more sunlight to come in. We see insects flying around in the warmth of that sunlight, and the peewee flies out and feeds on them. And there's a nest, a very small nest there on that birch of an eastern wood peewee. This one says its name. Peewee! Yeah. It's done there. So it's really great when a bird says its own name. And if you come back here next month in April, Bridget Butler, aka the Bird Diva, is going to be doing a much more detailed bird-specific show, and she may even imitate that vocally herself and not rely on the technology to play the song. She's fabulous, and you should come hear her if you're available. Eastern wood peewee. And then I think this is the last one I was going to share with you here. This is the wood thrush. And the important thing with sugar bush management here is to develop not just that lowest understory where the black-throated blue warbler nested, but as that grows higher, it gets into kind of a second layer we call in the forest the mid-story. So understory is ground level to head height, more or less, 5-6 feet. Mid-story is 6 feet to about 30 feet. So these different layers of vegetation in the woods are what's going to really make it the best thing. And wood thrush tend to nest between 6 and 10 feet above the ground. So we want to have that structure in there for them to be able to do that. And of these birds, this is probably my favorite song. Hear that on the end there? We call that shattering glass sound to it. Amazing that there's like multiple things happening in that song at once. Just an incredible songster. All right, and so to kind of wrap things up here, these are all of the, obviously not going to go through and read them all, but just a kind of list of the producers that are currently using the labeling on their products and have that signage to kind of promote their efforts for what they're doing to intentionally think about birds in their sugar bush management. Of course, any of this stuff requires funding for us to be able to do our work, and so I wanted to make sure I acknowledged some of the significant funders that have helped us to get this going and keep us going here throughout time. I'm just going to add with kind of what often comes down to the economics of all of this and the importance of what we're really trying to do is we're using, it's called market-based conservation. We're trying to use the necessity for us all to make a living. Maple producers certainly part of that, but to do that in a way that also is aiding our conservation efforts. So just quick numbers here. So we have these 27 producers. All told, there's currently about 6,000 acres of sugar bush in Vermont, which is being managed with considerations, intentional consideration with birds in mind. Annually, that comes out to about 139,000 gallons of maple syrup off of those sugar bushes. And this is the number that blows me away. If we use that kind of standard $40 a gallon metric to kind of come up with it, it's about $5.5 million annually of bird-friendly syrup that's out there in the marketplace. And that's significant. And so we really are trying to bring together the economics, the habitat, the bird conservation value, and I think we're getting there. We're doing it in meaningful ways. We need what we'd like to see is certainly more people understanding what this means when they see it. If you go to your local store and you don't see syrup that is bearing that label, ask them for it. There's syrup out there which has that label, and that'll just help to advance the project even further and have those many benefits, not just to birds, but to the forest and to our maple industry. So with that, I'm going to end there. We do have a couple minutes if people do have some questions. I also have, if you'd like to take with you a brochure on the project, I'll leave them over here on the table. Please feel free to grab one of those on the way out. And thank you for coming. So does anyone have any questions? Comments? Yeah.
Yes. What makes the difference between organic sap and a non-organic sap or syrup?
Sure. So organic is that you would think that many people think all syrup is organic. It's natural product. There's about 5 pages of criteria that make it organic. It's everything from what happens in the forest, in the sugar bush, to the transfer of that sap to the sugar house, to the processing of that sap, to the packaging of that sap. There's things all along that chain which you have to adhere to in order to be organic. Just as an example, we have to very often add a defoamer in the evaporator. As that sap is boiling, it can boil up and want to boil over the evaporator. So putting a little drop of some kind of an oil in the back pan to break that surface tension, bring it down. Well, back in the day, some people used to hang a slab of bacon over the evaporator, and it would drip that. We don't do that anymore. There's a chemical defoamer called Atmos 3000. I have no idea what it is. I won't use it. I'm not organic yet, but I hope to be. I use safflower oil to do that. If you're organic, though, you have to use an organic defoamer. There's just, you have to, some of the same forest management stuff we talked about with birds, you also have to adhere to be organic. So a lot of organic producers are almost here to bird friendly. There's a couple things we address that they don't. But like I said, it's 4 or 5 pages of things that you have to adhere to technically be called organic certified. Yeah.
Do you know how many of your producers, what percentage are organic?
Good question. I don't know definitively. I would say probably 50% of them are, though. And that's, I think sometimes anybody's hesitant to, what's this all about? I'm not sure I want to get involved with this. And then if they find out that they're almost there anyway, well, let's take a look at it and say, we don't have to do a lot more that's different than what we're already doing, so we might as well add this to it, and we can promote ourselves as being bird friendly too. But it's probably somewhere around 50% that are organic. Yep.
Do a lot of producers use pesticides?
Pesticides? No, I would say that not a lot of producers use pesticides. Although so going back to the organic, there are things, sometimes an herbicide might be used in the forest. So if you have, these non-native plants, they're really hard to manage to begin with. If people are really trying to be successful at it, they often use an herbicide. But you can't do that in sugar bush. You can't use those herbicides. There are only certain things you can use in order to address that invasive species problem. Another one is if even just the marking of trees. A forester would go, if you're going to do some thinning or some management activity where you're harvesting trees, a forester should go in there and paint those trees. A little bit of paint. There's only certain kinds of paint that can be used on the tree, even though they're not maple trees that you're necessarily cutting, in your sugar bush that you can still be organic. So it's like it comes from all over the place, these considerations that need to happen. But pesticides, no, I don't. Pesticides.
You can't use galvanized buckets anymore, and you can't use the old barrels that we used to use for storage and transfer.
Yeah.
It has to be a specific barrel as well.
Yeah, galvanized, it's a lead thing, and a lot of old galvanized things did have lead in them. I don't think well, maybe it is. I don't know if you can't use it, but you definitely should be testing your syrup if you are using galvanized. If you're organic. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
People still use them, but not
right.
trying to be organic.
Right. Yep.
We changed all the barrels and all that.
Yeah, stainless costs a lot more money, but that's kind of where we have to go with a lot of it.
Another question, you're allowed to use the plastic tubing?
Yes.
That's okay.
Yep. Absolutely. And again, most producers, I don't know, 99.5%, unless they just have a couple trees in their backyard, are using the tubing anymore, not the buckets. just because of the efficiency of collecting all that sap. As the industry expands, we not only have more people doing it, the size of the operations. I'm not a Vermonter. I've been here about 20 years. When I came here, a big operation, if you had 10,000 taps, you were pretty big. Now, if you don't have 30,000 taps, you're not really very big. And they go all the way up. We have a couple of producers that are approaching, they're in the 80 to 90,000 tap category. That equates to a lot more acreage, so 1,000 or more acres of tapped wood. So you can imagine if you had 1,000 acres and you managed that all to be sugar maple, how impactful that would be, say compared to someone who has 10 acres that they're doing that on. So scale does matter on what the impacts are going to be in the forest. But not all big industrial producers are bad. You can be extremely big and still manage those woods in a way that's good for birds and the forest ecosystem in general. Yeah.
Doesn't the temperature still affect the trees, even though they're doing pipelines? I was talking to someone the other day and said they still need freezing at night.
Yes.
To work properly.
You do. The old thing was, cold nights and warm days. That's what you need. Nights below freezing. That freezing in the tree draws water up through the roots into the tree. Then when you get a thaw the next day, you create this positive pressure, a greater pressure in the tree than outside the tree. Therefore, the sap wants to find any way out. Nature likes to equalize itself, and so the pressures are trying to equalize, forces the sap out of the tree. When we used buckets, that differential was extremely important. Some places you might have had to be 45 degrees before you got a run to happen. With the tubing systems and vacuum pumps, which many use, that differential is less important. It's still important, but on a 35-degree day, after a 25-degree night, if you're on a vacuum, you might get sap. Whereas if you're on buckets before it, because what you're doing is decreasing the pressure in the tubing system, which makes the pressure of the tree greater, and therefore the sap comes out.
Now, this extended work spell we're having is going to affect the budding, they're saying, on some of the trees also.
It may. I think we're still early enough. I mean, it's still February. I have to remind myself that.
Not exactly stopping.
No. If we had a continued warm, if it stayed this warm for a couple of weeks, then I think the red maple in particular, soft maple, would start to bud. I don't think that'll happen just yet. In March, we'll most definitely get colder. Again, I think, we've been sugaring. I think it's going to shut off in March for a time because the temperatures are just not going to get warm enough. But that's the variability has just really changed, it seems.
What is the cost to the producer of joining this project?
Great question. 0. So as it stands now, as kind of this we're beyond the pilot phase, but these funders have made it possible. We didn't want any cost to keep people that were interested in wanting to do it. As we move forward, we're trying to look at a model for how producers can, essentially there's free marketing in this by being involved, and is there a way that we can, without making it be prohibitive, that we can have maybe a one-time fee to get into it or something like that. But unlike organic, which has an annual fee associated with it, we currently don't have any cost to the producer.
You get more money for it?
No, at this point in time, no. And even organic on the retail market, most people aren't getting more for organic. When they sell it in bulk, in barrels, they'll get a premium from the buyers. There's only a couple big buyers of maple syrup in the state that repackage it and then put it out to the retail. So it does make a difference when you're selling it that way. Bird Friendly has not yet found its way to that bulk market where we have buyers willing to pay that premium, but I'm working on it. I'd love to, even a small premium, something that says, you know what, we value this, and might get more producers to say, yep, let's switch over.
Do you think current use would be part of, or could be part of
Yeah.
bird friendly?
So in order to, one of the requirements, basic requirements is you don't have to be in current use, but you do have to have a forest management plan, which you do. I'm sorry?
We do, so we could be in the bird friendly.
You could be in the bird friendly if after we, come and do the assessment of your sugar bush and kind of look at the gaps between our criteria, which I didn't bring along with me, and what the current condition is, and you say, okay, we see these differences, we agree to address them in our plan, then you would be considered bird friendly. Yeah. But in the absence, because so much of this recognition is about your future planning efforts. If people have said, well, if someone's forest isn't currently have all these things, how can you say they're bird friendly? Well, it's because they're intentionally managing for that in the future. If I waited for every sugar bush to have at least 25% non-sugar maple and have the understory growth we want and all those things, I'd be waiting 10 years before anybody got a sticker. Forest management, as you know, happens it's not every year that you're doing stuff. It takes time, and activities in the woods might happen only once every 15 years. So if your plan says you're shooting for that, that's what we're looking for. Yeah.
Isn't the composition of the forest changing as a result of the changing climate?
Composition of the forest is changing, and it's going to most likely change even more in years ahead. Now, we've got a long time before sugar maple is no longer one of the dominant trees in Vermont. But the projections are that things like red oak and shagbark hickory, trees that we find down in the mid-Atlantic, are going to become more increasingly common as what the new growth is up here. Some of the most significant changes in that tree species composition will be as you go higher in elevation. So right now, if you go up Jay Peak or Mansfield or something, you get up into that spruce and fir forest type projection that at some point, northern hardwoods will be all the way to the top of Mansfield. So yes, the tree species composition will change. It's not going to happen overnight. Sugar maples aren't going to die because temperatures have increased so much, but they're not going to germinate and regenerate. Sugar maple needs a period below freezing to germinate in the soil. And if we get to the point someday where that doesn't happen, sugar maple's not going to regenerate. Great questions. Any others? All right. Again, thank you.